Welcome to the guide, Exile. In this guide, we are going to be discussing Elder and Shaper influence that can spawn on and move around the maps within the Atlas. But before we begin, I would like to remind you that this guide was made in partnership with fellow content creator and Atlas guru, Karv. You can find him on Twitch, YouTube, Twitter, and Discord, which I have linked in the video description. Important note, in every major expansion or patch, the Atlas can be, or is reshuffled to add, remove, and change map locations and tiers around. This reshuffling does not change the base mechanics of the Atlas, so all of the core rules, ideas, and general recommendations will still hold true. To apply what is discussed in these guides, just disconnect the names from the maps and apply the general rules and ideas to the Atlas as it currently stands. As talked about in prior Atlas guides, there are two main bosses of the Atlas, the Elder and the Shaper, and they each have their own respective influence within it. When you first begin the Atlas, you will be dealing with just the Shaper influence. There will be a single map base with the Shaper influence on it. This of course can be locked as you have yet to run these maps, and this is indicated by the star-filled void behind the map on the Atlas. It is through Zana's questline discussed in the Zana and Master's Guide, in which you explore these Shaper influences through Zana's instruction in the lower tiers of the Atlas. The Shaper will also take over the map boss of the influenced map, shortly freezing time and providing that boss life regeneration, more attacks, or summon a void unshaped monster to increase the difficulty of the fight. You will first start to see the Shaper's influence on adjacent Tier 2 map of the first Tier 1 map that you complete. After completing the Tier 2 Shaper influenced map, the Shaper influence will then move to a Tier 3 map, which may or may not be connected to the current Tier 2 map. You will then have to work your way through Tier 3, 4, 5, and 6 Shaper influenced maps via the same mechanics, gaining progression with Zana with each completion of these directed quests to examine the influence further. Upon completion of your first Tier 6 map with the Shaper influence, the Elder will enter the Atlas through his Void portal and confront Shaper. At this point, Shaper can and will randomly influence maps around the Atlas, and you will now also begin to see maps with Elder influence, starting from the map that you encountered him for the first time. This is indicated by the dark swirling tentacles behind the maps. Whilst in these maps, you can tell which influence is taking hold by looking at the ground. Shaper-influenced maps will have broken parts of the ground gaze into the void, while Elder maps will have tentacles and malignant growths all over the ground. The Elder's influence needs to be connected to other Elder influence when there are more than 2 Elder influenced maps on your Atlas, while the Shaper's influence does not need to be connected to other Shaper influence. So the Elder influence will spread as a blob via connected maps, whilst the Shaper influence will spawn on regular single maps with no need to be connected. Influence will also never spawn on unique maps. These influences are very important to the progression of your Atlas through Zana's questline, as well as the extra benefits that they provide. Influence will cause extra mechanics and monsters to be added to the map. Here is what the Shaper will add. As you can see, many of these things are from his endgame encounter. Here's what the Elder will add. Ultimately, these influenced maps alone can add a lot of monster density and will be important to later Atlas strategies. It is important to note that these mechanics are not added to maps that have an Elder or Elder Guardian spawned on it. Beyond just adding more mechanics and monsters, what is the purpose of these influences and how can you directly influence them? Well, let's talk about some of the special drops from these maps as well as moving the influence around. There are special rare items known as Elder and Shaper items denoted by an animated background and an icon on their nameplate. Shaper items have a star-filled void background and a red star icon in their nameplate, while Elder items have a moving tentacle background and a blue cross icon in their nameplate. These will drop in their respective influenced maps, so you will only get Shaper items in Shaper-influenced maps and Elder items in Elder-influenced maps, and neither from non-influenced maps. Elder and Shaper items are special variants of regular base items and have a lower drop rate than regular rare items, due to the fact that they can roll special affixes. Elder and Shaper items will always drop rare and will be guaranteed to have at least one of the special Elder or Shaper modifiers on them. For example, you can get built-in high-level gems in an item, expanding it to a 5 or 6 link as seen here with both of the Shaper and Elder helmets. There are also other prominent affixes such as shields that raise your maximum elemental resistance or recover a percentage of your life on block. Like with all other item bases, you can scour these to a normal rarity and craft them with all of the applicable currencies without losing the Shaper or Elder base. As with any other crafting, the higher the item level, the better the affixes are, and so too the value of the item. Note, Elder items have an affinity to attack-based modifiers, while Shaper items have an affinity to spell-based modifiers. To move or remove the influences around your atlas, you simply have to kill the boss of the map with the influence on it, or the majority of monsters within it. The event of maps changing influence is referred to as an atlas tick. An atlas tick can occur when completing other maps on the atlas without influence as well, allowing influences to move on their own randomly. This is where the process of moving and maintaining influence can get a bit confusing and frustrating. It is worth noting that an influence will only move on its own and consume more than one map after you have completed the first 5 Shaper influenced maps of Zana's questline and then spawn Elder influence. So for example, say that you have a Shaper influenced map that is all by itself and not surrounded by any Elder influence. Completing this map will remove the influence and possibly move it to another random map on the atlas, although this is not always guaranteed. Shaper can also randomly spawn his influence on any non-unique map in your atlas, even if you complete non-influenced maps. However, if you complete a Shaper influenced map that is bordered and connected to an Elder influenced map on the atlas, this will cause the Elder to influence the Shaper influenced map that you have just completed. This works the other way around as well, wherein completing an Elder influenced map bordered by a Shaper influenced map will cause the Shaper to take the Elder influenced map back. In order for the Shaper to stop spawning randomly and to only focus on battling the Elder influence, the Elder influence must cover a minimum of 7 maps. Elder influence will be rivaled by Shaper influence within 1 to 2 atlas ticks without your direct interaction. Shaper will no longer spawn on random maps in the atlas and only maps adjacent to the Elder influence. Usually prior to 7 maps within the Elder influence, there is little to no Shaper influence bordering the Elder influence for you to spread it to the 7 map minimum. In this scenario, you simply have to complete any maps within your atlas to force atlas ticks to proc the random growth of Elder influence. The minimum number of 7 Elder influence maps is important to remember for later influence strategies. Now when you are spreading the Elder influence, it is important to try and ensure that none of the maps on the Elder influence blob edge that you are trying to spread have 2 or more connected Shaper influenced maps bordering it for numerous atlas ticks. This can result in Shaper taking back the Elder influence map and possibly decimating a large portion of the Elder influence blob. For example, here we can see that we have Elder influence on Phantasmagoria and we want to spread it up through Tropical Island to make it into red tier maps. When we do so, we have a choke point on Phantasmagoria wherein Shaper influence could move from Bazaar and completely remove the upper Elder influence blob that we are trying to expand into Tropical Island and beyond. To avoid this from happening, we can run a Bazaar to effectively buffer the Elder influence, thus giving us more atlas ticks to recover from automated movement of the other influences. Now if Shaper is to take Bazaar in a move, it won't break the Elder influence blob and Bazaar can be run again to rebuffer it. I would generally recommend running the buffer maps before the maps you wish to expand the influence in, such that you will not get undermined during the proper influence expansion. Ultimately, in doing this buffering and maintaining possible choke points by running a few extra maps, you can avoid the destruction of the Elder influence blob and save a lot of frustration. Once you have 20 Elder influenced maps, Elder will spawn on a randomly chosen map that can be within his influence or on one that was taken within the last atlas tick. He will also have an affinity to spawn in the higher tier maps within the influence blob. From here, his influence blob can grow to a maximum of 30 maps. However, Elder and his guardians can despawn after you reach 20 consecutive atlas ticks of not killing any of his guardians. The despawn counter is reset upon killing a guardian. If he despawns, any influence that is tied via atlas connections between him and his guardians will be removed, possibly leaving a small or very large portion of remaining Elder influence depending on the original influence layout. So you will not be able to keep an Elder spawned indefinitely. After you defeat Elder, all of his influence will be removed. In order for his influence to return to the atlas, you must complete anywhere from 1 to dozens of atlas ticks. You do not need to run just Shaper influence maps, any maps will work. However, be aware that Elder influence will spawn at or around the tier of map that was last run prior to it appearing, so running higher tier maps can be beneficial to jumpstart your Elder influence to spread into red tier maps. To learn more about encountering Elder and his guardians, check out my guide on the Elder. So with all of that explained, you can get out there and start interacting with influence. Later in the series, within the Advanced Topics guides, we will be discussing manipulating influence for further atlas farming strategies and beneficial places to put it to make the most out of the monsters that it provides. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one, Exile.